It is time to talk about Hurricane Helene, or Helen, however you want to say that, because it has now been about roughly 5 days since it made landfall specifically in the Carolinas and Tennessee. And I wanted to talk about it because, though, yes, lots and lots of people, especially online, have been talking about it because, again, this is one of the few benefits of the cancer that is Twitter, is that Twitter, X is Twitter, will always be arguably the best place online, let alone in the world, to be able to access live time, film and live streams, video clips, photographs, and people just, writing up and talking about their firsthand experiences, experiencing things like major natural disasters, wars, or whatever else. You find out stuff there first that sometimes you will only ever find there from people who are literally on the ground in real situations. And no doubt this has happened yet again, as usual, when it comes down to this case, the realities of people experiencing the after effects, the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. I gotta say, Hurricane Helene is playing out identically to how the responses, or lack thereof, was to the Maui fires, along with how Australia had responded, or in their case, literally not responded or cared at all, about the record-shattering catastrophic flooding that happened in the Three Rivers region of the East Coast. That was specifically around Byron Bay and Byron and all those other towns in that area. It's a very conscious, very spiritual, very self-sustaining kind of communities all throughout there, and they absolutely got decimated. In fact, technically, twice, I think 2 years in a row, by these very much man-made, record-breaking storms. And so they knew about these things about 24 hours ahead of time down there, and they never had any government response of any level, of any kind there. It was all the residents for themselves. They all had to try to rescue each other, and literally they did everything on their own. Maui, of course, is a case of they also would have had to do pretty much everything on their own. The problem was that the government, via the National Guard and FEMA and the Red Cross, were all immediately, as soon as they responded, they were just erecting visual barriers and thus physical barriers to access any parts of Lahaina, which is where the main fires burned, and they burned like 80% of the town down to ash. And so, of course, people lost literally everything, including their loved ones and other things like that in this fire, and they were not allowed back to their properties, so to their homes, the ashes of what remained. For months, they refused to allow literally anybody to enter the town, except for, of course, go figure, themselves. And there was a really fishy, of course, as we all know. And on top of that, they also blocked a bunch of aid that was trying to get in. I remembered watching that live, like how many people that were literally leading these like aid convoys that were literally getting stopped at the ports. They were getting stopped at the heliports. They were getting stopped at the airports. Everywhere they showed up, they were getting told, no, you cannot bring this aid here. You cannot bring it here. You cannot bring it here. You're not allowed. You're not allowed. You're not allowed. You cannot do this. We will not let it happen. They just prevented aid for like a month or two straight, and it was just infuriating because it's like, what the hell is wrong with you? And it was a month and a half in to where the Biden administration finally decided, here's a one-time check of $700. Even if you're a full family and you lost literally everything, you get $700. This is because we care. Get it? We care. Meanwhile, that exact same congressional and senatorial sessions, they had given Ukraine somewhere between the range of 30 to 60 billion dollars. Their own people, right, that our government's supposed to serve, they gave them $700 each. If they were lucky and eligible because they didn't already take the chance to move away, because there's no way they're going to afford anything else in Hawaii. It's Hawaii. It's never going to happen, right? So it's painfully similar to those two, like egregiously so, for those reasons. So Helene absolutely devastated the hell out of Western North Carolina and Eastern Tennessee. Absolutely, Kingsport, Asheville, just all these different places there just got absolutely decimated. So like those two other incidents, the response and the aid from the government has been absolutely non-existent so far. Again, we are about 5 full days since the devastation happened, the direct impact from Helene and what was left of it as it came apart hit those two places and the rest of that region, because of course a bunch of states come together there. So South Carolina definitely needs to be involved, same with Georgia. But yeah, and they absolutely got just decimated. It's been entirely the victims of the flooding and the devastation there that have been taking care of absolutely everything. It's the victims, the people who lost their homes, the people who lost probably a lot of loved ones, the people who don't know where their loved ones are. Maybe they don't know where their loved ones are that are furry, so they're animals, you know, their pet fur family, their pets. People have obviously probably lost their jobs. Some of them have probably lost their businesses permanently because they can't afford to be able to, you know, restore it or find a new place to run it and start it back up from scratch again. Again, these are all the impacts of this kind of a situation, is that you're going to lose literally everything, and a lot of people are going to be potentially permanently screwed from this. And they're the ones who are left to pick up the pieces and do everything on their own. There is zero National Guard response. There has been zero FEMA response. There's zero government response of any kind. There's no aid or anything. Again, it's been almost a full week, 5 full days, just about. When you see this, it will be full 5 days since it happened. And still absolutely zilch. Nothing. Nada. Zero. Null. Null. It's obscene. To have the victims immediately have to, probably without any sleep, if any at all, you know, have to go out there and use their own eyes and hands to not only try to pick up the pieces of their own lives, but God knows how many other people, sift through rubble, wade through the flood waters, God knows what's in it at this point, have to go try to run rescues, try to help find people who are trapped, people who, again, are dead now, people who are injured or maimed from it. They have to try to figure out how the heck to still support themselves in their lives by, you know, somehow getting some sort of food and water in their systems. Obviously, the water systems are down. The electrical grid is still completely toast there. Nobody has any electricity unless, again, they were fortunate enough to have volunteers with some good money be able to bring in supplies like, you know, electric generators. Maybe some businesses didn't suffer as much damage as others that actually had some well-protected major, like, industrial level and strength backup generators that people could use if they were allowing them to do that, if they could even get there, to be able to make sure it was okay and safe, and then actually help other people be able to connect to it. You know, solar panels and things like that, being able to bring in those kind of things to be able to, and thus generator banks and battery storage, to be able to store that energy, to be able to allow people to charge their phones and do whatever else, get some things back up online. And there's been a few people, not too many of course, but there's been a handful of people who have had enough fortunate money in their lives to be able to come in voluntarily. I don't think they live in the area, but they came in from areas that weren't as devastated, at least, as soon as they could, to be able to set up, and this was now like 3 days ago when you see this, they set up solar panels and thus electric banks, generator banks at 2 different places in Asheville, North Carolina, and Starlink, so that people had internet, so that way they could actually let people know, specifically their loved ones, of course, but other people as well that might be concerned about them, that might know from elsewhere, that they are alive and that they are currently safe and they are as good as they can be given the circumstances. Which is beautiful, but also, again, kind of bittersweet, because, again, this proves one thing. It's the everyday citizens of this country and of the states, these victims, in fact, themselves, that are having to figure out how to literally deal with not just the devastation that they've experienced, having potentially no home ever again, potentially no vehicles or anything to get around in, potentially permanently lost their jobs, God knows what else, lost some loved ones. Again, that's the worst case scenario. They're having to probably deal with seeing, you know, dead people in their communities, or having to try to find the dead, or try to rescue people who are injured or maimed from it that somehow have still managed to survive. And of course, they're having to coordinate somehow a way to keep themselves sustained with food and water that isn't accessible right now. And we'll get to why that is at the moment, along with, again, you know, for everyone else as well. So being able to somehow coordinate aid if they're able to, or, get to somewhere where maybe they have their helicopter stored if they're one of the really rich people, which again is a bittersweet thing because it's been up to the people who are private helicopter owners. They're solitary. They fly their own helicopters. It's their own personal helicopters. Probably a hobbyist thing, right? But they've had to come out of the woodwork to immediately jump on that opportunity, likely still experiencing the devastation themselves, to be able to access these things, the ones that were fortunate enough that they didn't get destroyed or whatever, and they were able to fly them out and somehow go elsewhere to fuel them somewhere relatively nearby and then come through to be able to do that themselves. These are civilian, like, R-44 helicopters. Okay, these are not your normal, or R-34s. These are not your normal, aid helicopters or transport helicopters. These are not made for this use, but they're doing it anyway. They don't have the specific specialized training that we'll get to that, say, the National Guard has. They don't have that. None of these, or at least most of them probably don't. And yet they're just sacrificing their own time, their own money, their own vehicles, their own supplies, their own gear, their own lives, technically. They're putting their own lives on the line more than they already had, just to try to help locate people's loved ones, to try to get a lay of the land, how it's altered and changed, because obviously with that much flooding and that much power and wind and devastation, it's going to erode things like a motherfucker. It's going to absolutely change entire, river systems and creeks and, even the topography and scape of lakes and ponds. I mean, all the water bodies are going to be heavily altered, especially in the epicenter. They are going to be absolutely devastated themselves. Things have probably changed course now, things like that. Obviously, roads are completely decimated and eroded out and destroyed. And it's continuing to get worse, of course, because of the waterlogging and the rest of the water still trying to find its way out of where it normally isn't. And then again, the changed courses are going to exacerbate that further. And again, these are people that are these are the victims technically, and they have to do it on them or on their own. So obviously the straightforward question that almost anybody's going to ask is, but why? Where and why is the government not present? Nor any kind of major aid group. Where the heck are they? Why aren't they there? Why have they failed to provide any aid of any kind at all? So I would say this, consider this. The day before the Carolinas and Tennessee were nailed by Helene, the National Guard of North Carolina and Tennessee, both. So again, this has been known for like a week, maybe longer ahead of time, that they were going to probably suffer a direct hit and get major damage. Both the states, as National Guards, decided to send a huge chunk of their active personnel, their active National Guard troops, to Kuwait. The day before, they sent them to Kuwait. So instead of preparing for their states, literally their job description, their duties, the point of the National Guard, one of the specialized trainings that they have is literally to immediately respond, sometimes preemptively, set up things for major national disasters. I think it's the national again. Major natural disasters. I don't know why my brain keeps wanting to say national. But yes, and so the National Guard, this is their specialized training. Like, this is literally one of the main, if not the dominant purpose that they exist for, is to immediately jump into action and help anywhere and everywhere they can, even preemptively, for natural disasters. But instead of preparing for this, knowing it was going to happen, in this case, a day before even, they're like, nah, you go over to Kuwait. But probably should be part of Iraq anyway, different story. But yeah, and you go over to Kuwait now for reasons why, well, nobody apparently knows. Because if you haven't noticed, not only has the mainstream media not said a peep about the whole National Guard being sent to Kuwait, because this is actually not just these states. This has been going on for the last month or so. Just about every single state in the Union has actually, so just about all 50 states, have actually sent their National Guard to Kuwait over the course of the last month. Which itself raises a lot of red flags and makes you question a lot of things, because not only is the government, or I should say governments and politicians, not said a peep about it, nor has the mainstream media, and nor has even a lot of the big independent media outlets. None of those big names, like the Epoch Times, as far as I understand, they haven't said a word about it. So it makes you really sit there and wonder, and it's something to let sink in, by the way, because that's really weird. Even more so nefarious seeming is, again, the fact that they waited until the day before to then send them to Kuwait. That is Tennessee and North Carolina, which at least at the current time seem to have been the worst hit by Helene of all the states, including the state that took the most direct hit, which of course was, go figure, Florida via the Panhandle. That's where Helene made landfall, and it did it direct as a actual hurricane. By the time you get up to North Carolina and Tennessee and the Appalachians, it's obviously going to be at most a tropical depression, if not just already have fractured up enough that it may not even be a tropical depression anymore. But you might wonder, why is it that it was the most devastating there? It's because of a lot of different dynamic reasons, but the main reason why is because when hurricanes fall apart, also known as typhoons, by the way, or cyclones, depending on where you are in the world, when they fall apart and they break up because they've been on land too long, due to weather conditions, barometric pressure, and things like that, they actually have to dump all the rest of their precipitation. So when they do that, and they also have collected a bunch more, as it's, of course, the evaporations happen, not just from the flooding it's caused from the rains that's already dumped around the area, but also, of course, just general evaporation and other precipitation and humidity, basically, that has existed in the air as it's traveled through those areas. So as a result, naturally, it sucks that up too, and then by the time it falls apart, it has to dump everything out at once. So it just falls apart and everything comes out of it at once. So that's how you get the most devastating with hurricanes, is actually after it usually makes landfall. Is usually the worst case scenario, because that's when things really get bad, when it comes down to the just torrential rains and flooding. It may not have remotely as severe winds, but it will have a ridiculous amount of rain, more so than a lot of places where it's out in the ocean or just making landfall. And if you think about the fact that most of the states across the country have sent out almost the entirety, at least half, if not almost the entirety of their National Guard units, means also that the National Guard has now heavily depleted itself of active troop members, meaning that the National Guard has a very pathetic, measly, bare minimum amount of active members that exist in sporadically across each of the rest of the states. And that means that they are heavily depleted in their ability to really send anyone and respond to anything. So that's another major red flag and reason why they can't really do anything. Besides the fact that, again, for both of these things, the media really hasn't said a word about it either, nor has the government, which is itself a major red flag. So here's another thing to just take the time to let sink in. The day before Helene made landfall in Florida, so again, about 5 days ago or so, 5 days to a week ago, the United States government, the federal government, good old US government, sent Ukraine $8 billion and Israel $9 billion to fund their war machines. So $17 billion, the day before it makes landfall, gets sent to people who, it's technically our money, by the way, taxpayer money. They're taking our money, sending it to other countries and saying, here, this is yours now, to continue to fund mass decimation of life known as war. And they do that the day before it makes landfall in Florida, meaning, again, they've known about this and knew it was going to make direct landfall and tear through the US for at least a week, probably much, much longer than that. That's something to emphasize and, again, let sink in. What's with this whole day, the day before they know it's about to make direct hits and landfalls, this devastating hurricane? Is it with the governments and not only sending all their aid crews, that is the National Guard, out to halfway across the world for reasons that they will not tell us, we their people, but on top of that, also send other nations our hard-earned tax money in the billions of dollars, tens of billions, also the day before. It's just stuff to really let sink in, because something is very off there. Now, tying this back into Maui, because I'm sure there's a lot of people that are like, what does this have to do with Maui? Well, it's a lot of similarities. If you think back to Maui, this last bit I just talked about is identical to what happened with Maui. Because Maui, again, I actually had to aforemention this, and this is also something you really need to give time to let sink in. When the Maui fires were happening and then happened, so current and past tense, the government decided to give Ukraine somewhere in the range of $30 to $60 billion, I believe it was at the time. Just hand them over $30 to $60 billion. Meanwhile, that exact same session decided here, victims of the fires that completely decimated 80% of the entire city of Lahaina, here's $700 one-time check. No questions asked. That's all you get. Have fun. Doesn't matter if you're one person or if you had a family of 5. You get $700 one time. I swear it was $900, but apparently a lot of people are saying $700. It might be. Either way, the point is it doesn't matter if it's $200 difference. Either way, that's nothing, especially at the cost of Maui, let alone Hawaii in general, is egregiously and lethally, offensively, obscenely expensive in cost of living, let alone in housing, whether it's rental, leasing, or purchase. It really should be illegal to be that expensive at base price, but that's just Hawaii for you. And so, yeah, that's literally nothing. Nothing at all. Especially when you've lost literally everything. You've lost your job, because it's ash. You've lost your home. That's literally ash. You've lost your vehicle. That's melted to what looks like a piece of plastic, which should never happen with a natural fire. That doesn't happen, by the way. That's just a fact. It does not happen. It's impossible. So it's not a natural fire that happened on Maui. Different story. The point is, they've lost everything. Here's $700. Just don't look at the $80 billion we just handed to another country to wage mass decimation, a life we call war. And that wasn't even the first time they gave them tens of billions of dollars. By that point, I think it was already over 120 billion total they had given to Ukraine. That's something to let sink in, because that's a similarity. Because in this case, it's tied into giving Israel and Ukraine the equivalent bound together of $17 billion the day before Helene made landfall in Florida. Now, year to date, Maui has only received roughly around $3 billion in aid. That's it. This is for the fires alone. They received just barely $3 billion in aid. Now, this was like, what, about 2 years ago that the Maui fires happened? $3 billion. Roughly. That's all that they've got. Not counting the individual people getting one check, $700 or $900. That's it. To this day. You want to know how much, again? Just Israel got this same week? $9 billion. Interesting how that works. And again, that's not counting entirely together since October 7th of 2023, which is now just short of being year to date, exactly a full 365 days, a year later from that day. Israel's at least received, I believe, around 200 billion by this point, I think it is, since then from the US. So from us, we the taxpayers. It's our hard-earned money going to, in the hundreds of billions, towards not just Israel, but Ukraine. Since the Ukraine situation erupted, this current war with Russia, whatever you want to call it, it's been somewhere around, I believe, 500 billion that's been sent to them, but 3 billion for our own people. Sounds about right, doesn't it? Just let that sink in. And just this is for like some potential foresight, because you gotta use experience and what we've already experienced and seen before in the past, especially the recent past, with our own government and their aid responses. So the last major natural, or well, I should just say the last major disaster that happened here in the United States was, of course, again, the Maui fires, specifically the one that burned 80% of Lahaina to ash. Looking back to that, something to keep in mind, again, just for posterity's sake, just in case in the future some of this plays out. Within about a week after it happened, the National Guard shows up, and so does FEMA, and so does the Red Cross. And what did they do when they first got there, and what did they do really the whole time that they were there? They immediately erected those fences I aforementioned that were both a physical barrier and a visual barrier. So nobody could see in or out, and also nobody, not even the residents who lost everything, were allowed to enter or exit or pass through the town, specifically the main devastated zone. That's the first thing they did. They made damn sure that they blockaded and they prevented, even if by force they had to, the hysterical residents who lost everything, who just want to go in and go through whatever ashes are left of their home and their things. Maybe try to find a loved one that probably burnt alive in there. They refused to allow them for months. This went on. Now, on top of that, the next thing they did, as I also aforementioned, is they blockaded and prevented aid caravans and aid of any kind reaching Maui. When it got to Maui, whether it was managed to achieve reaching the airports or a landing strip, somebody's yards, or a helipad, or of course a port or a dock, or even got shuttled in via little skiffs and other dinghy-like things, rowboats or rafts or whatever else, by even individual people. Sometimes they were desperate enough to try to get this aid off of these ships and these boats. What did the National Guard, FEMA, and Red Cross do? They said, absolutely not. You are not going to bring that onto land. You're not going to bring that to people, and you're certainly not going to bring that to any kind of an aid place. We will not allow this. It's not allowed to be done. You are not allowed. It is banned. You cannot do this. And so even people, again, a lot of the victims of the fires were like, what the fuck is wrong with you? What is with this? Like, this is literally aid. This contains medical supplies, medicines, insulin, food, safe drinking water, potentially clothing, blankets, whatever else. And you're telling them no, which means you're telling us no. We're not allowed to have aid. We're not allowed to have the things we literally need that burned away out of existence to ash, that you won't even let us sift through or go through or look at or figure out what's happened or what's going on or find any belongings that maybe could be salvaged? No. You're telling us no to literally everything. Our literal lives, you're saying, no, you're not allowed. You're not allowed to live. Stop living. Stop existing. That's basically what you're saying. They didn't care, of course, because guess what? Well, they're just following orders. They're just doing their job. They're doing what they're told to do and say what they're told to say. And that's just the orders that came from up top. I'm just a messenger. Don't shoot me. You're an adult. You're an autonomous living being. You have a fucking choice to defy your orders. Just a thought. But that's all that the National Guard and FEMA really actually did on Maui. It was nearly, I think, 3 months before they finally started to heavily regiment and police on like a reserve list, basically, of like who is allowed to go in, when, and where to evaluate their properties. And it finished, I think, somewhere within like a little over a year after the fire burned through town. It's obscene. And it's something, again, to keep in mind, because again, there's already a fair sufficient amount of parallel between Maui and, again, North Carolina, Tennessee, even a little bit of South Carolina and Georgia, and the devastation that they've encountered from the remnants of Hurricane Helene. Because this could reflect what we could expect to see in the future, especially considering this is our government's response for aid. It took, I think, about a month and a half or 2 months before the Red Cross was even able to fully coordinate and figure out what the heck they were doing, get their head on straight, to actually start allowing their own aid to come in and go through and be distributed, which is especially obscene. Because it was basically a branded thing. Like, oh, this is a brand deal. We have an exclusive agreement that like only Red Cross branded aid is allowed to be given. We can't allow this other aid because it's not like a partnered group, which it's kind of what it came off as, in my eyes, from my observations.
We're just tracking down the facts of what's happening. There's a lot of stuff on the internet Some of it's true, shockingly true, and we'll have the details on that. Some of it is not true. FEMA, I've seen one FEMA truck. I just interviewed them. They arrived last night. They had a communications truck, so they've got a big satellite so they can, talk to people on TV. They were tucked away. We were driving with 8, 9 people. I was the only one that saw the truck tucked way away from everyone. I said to them, what are you doing here? They were all sitting at a card table with one computer. And they said, well, we need to be where the people are. And I thought, well, the people aren't here. And we're getting them registered so they can sign up for government aid. Is a semi-truck driver who had been pulled over by FEMA, and they took his food off his truck because they know better.
Wow.
We have FEMA trying to shut down the Hilo field because the FAA isn't involved. Screw the FAA. If you had planes down here and you had helicopters yourself and you were rescuing them, then fine, we'd shut this down. But you're not here. And I really don't think they care.
I believe I've just kind of alluded to it at least earlier. But another fantastic parallel and comparison is Australia. It may have been 2021 and 2022. Actually, I think it was 2021 and 2022. Australia, specifically the region known as the Three Rivers region, which contains Byron Bay, a bunch of other places like that in the east coast of Australia. It's just a little way south of Gold Coast, for reference. And I remembered watching, again, this very much live from someone who actually at the time lived in Byron Bay and in the vicinity of Byron and Byron Bay in the Three Rivers region. And she was always going all throughout the Three Rivers region. Her name is Alicia. She was super valuable because she like live streaming certain things when she could after, of course, the storms had passed through. She was, or even in little pockets and windows that she got an opportunity during the storms and little breaks in it to be able to do it. Obviously, she recorded some videos. She got plenty of pictures, and she just kept showing people in the world like exactly what really was happening throughout that whole time, including actually before the floods even happened, before the weather happened.
We're seeing a few strange echoes turning up on the weather radar. Now, here are those mysterious patterns, the blue shades here showing up on the radar from the Gold Coast initially, then spreading up towards Brisbane this afternoon. But a quick look out the window shows completely clear skies, no cloud, just a little bit of smoke haze around. So what's going on? Well, here is what we do know. The signals started appearing late morning off Evans Head on the New South Wales coast here, then spread north and spread out before reaching southeast Queensland. While nothing has ever been confirmed, the best theory I have is that it's chaff or countermeasures, little particles used to hide planes in military exercises. These echoes are consistent with something being released into the atmosphere, possibly from a plane, then travelling on the prevailing winds. These echoes are consistent with something being released into the atmosphere, possibly from a plane, then travelling on the prevailing winds. Either way, it's definitely not rain.
And it was literally perfectly timed and paralleled and exactly matched to military via their air wing. And then you have commentary from this meteorologist. So basically he's putting the dots together without directly saying that's what's happening. Because of course he's not allowed to do that, because he'd probably maybe even have his life risks for that. Because you don't say these things. It was clear that's what it was. So when there's weather manipulation via chemtrails, chemical trails, those are absolutely real. They're very fucking real. Because again, contrails, those dissipate very quickly. They cease existence very quickly because they're just vapor. They're steam. Chemtrails don't. They sit there. And they sit there and they expand and they expand and they keep expanding. And they stay there for a very long time. Those are chemtrails. Very different than contrails. Though they come from the same source, the reason why the other one stays and expands is because that's chemicals. That's why it's called a chemtrail. They're very real. Absolutely devastated the fuck out of that area. I remembered those the flooding was insane. It was like flooding I've never seen before in my life. I'm not kidding. It was ridiculous. Some places must have been somewhere around 20, 30 feet deep. of just pure water flood, flood waters. It was just ridiculous. Everywhere you looked was just nothing but water. Entire, 20-foot, 30-foot buildings were completely submerged. I mean, it was absurd. And there was zero government response. And that's why it relates right now to Hurricane Helene and the zero response from government or aid organizations that the Carolinas and Tennessee are experiencing right now and have since it started. There's been zero National Guard. There's been zero military of any kind. There's been zero FEMA. There's been zero Red Cross. There's literally not a single sign of a single organization. That's what I'm about to say. I'm not dyslexic, I swear. Aid organization at all. Same parallel. It's like exact same timing too. Like it was immediately, as soon as possible. Literal definition of ASAP. As soon as possible. People that were able to got out, got to their helicopters, they got to their boats, they got to their, their specialized vehicles that were used. Some people got ingenuity to them, took a bunch of wood debris and stuff and built rafts, right? It's the same thing in both Australia at the time and now in North Carolina and Tennessee. There's been a lot of that. People have immediately jumped as soon as they possibly could to be able to do that, to help search for people, rescue people, obviously get the lay of the land in the area, to see how bad the flooding was, how far it stretches, how bad the damage is, if there's more water that's going to suddenly gush from somewhere else that couldn't hold all the water at the time, because maybe it was a reservoir or something, or a handful of them that just could not release because nobody was able to safely manage them. So naturally, they just completely blew their banks. I mean, the whole shebang. Exactly what the National Guard's supposed to do. And as I aforementioned, these are like R-34 and R-44s. They are very small, lightweight, nimble helicopters that are meant more for training and for hobbyists, so personal piloting. Maybe one or two people in it at most, and you're just going to kind of, do leisurely flying for views or just practice or just enthusiast activities or whatever else, right? That's what they're using. And it was the same in Australia. Like immediately, as soon as people who had access to their helicopters and had licenses immediately got to their helicopters as soon as they could, to immediately, while the storms were coming through, it was still flooding worse. They were going through, flying them day and night, as long as they possibly could, risking their own lives and the helicopters themselves, because they were trying to stretch their fuel as far as they could, at the risk of literally running out of fuel and losing their helicopter and potentially themselves in the process. Fortunately, they were skilled and knowledgeable enough, and they had a good enough idea of where was a safe place to be able to fuel up again, and how their helicopter behaved during those kind of conditions, that they never experienced that, none of these pilots. And there wasn't too many. I think there was like a max of 3 at one point, but like one of them couldn't really do it very much, so it was mainly just 2 of them. And they were out there trying to spend as much time as they possibly could, even risking their own health and safety, because they weren't sleeping, a lot of them, because they were just trying to do everything they could to be self-sufficient and help their community members, to try to find anybody on a roof or anybody floating or trying to swim somewhere, somebody being swept away, like whatever else, to try to rescue them, other people to move them to safer ground or whatever else. And then, of course, later on, it was for not only checking on the full scale of the devastation and everything else, but also trying to locate anybody who was entrapped, anybody who was still alive, therefore still needed rescuing, anybody who was injured, maimed, or, of course, dead. It's a great way to be able to get your lay of the land and also lift things if you need to. That's what's happening now in North Carolina and Tennessee. That's what happened down there in Australia. Why? Same reason, both sides, both in Australia and right now in North Carolina and Tennessee with Helene. It's because there is no National Guard, there is no military at all, there's no government aid of any kind, so no FEMA, there is no Red Cross, there's literally nothingness. Nothing at all. And I think that it's important to keep that in mind, because these are the victims themselves that are having to do all this on their own, as I've already mentioned before, but it does bear repeating a lot with emphasis, because that's how important, how just wrong this is, that this is what is going on. One piece of the Australia thing, though, that I think is really an important detail to mention is that when I think it was about 2 weeks after the waters had receded from there. There was about 8 military personnel that showed up in a convoy vehicle. Basically, they were just posing for a photo op, is all they were really doing. They went into the devastated zone, 8 deep, in this vehicle, literally just so they could get photographs. To make it look like, oh look, we care, we're helping. Were they helping? Well, that was the first time they showed up. What did they do? They got their camera out first. The rest of the crew went and picked up, like this one in particular that Alicia recorded, picked up a barrel that they just found lying in the middle of the muddy road. Picked up the barrel, held it, making it look like they were in the middle of throwing it into their truck. They got the photographs at different angles. They literally just dropped, they didn't put it down. They dropped the fucking barrel again, got right back in the truck. The other ones who were taking photos a little further up got back in the truck too, and they just drove away. People were trying to ask them and talk to them and criticize them. They literally didn't say a word. They acted like nobody was there, got their photos, and left. That's PR is what that is. They're just trying to get their little advertising photographs. So it looks like they can say, see, you can't say we didn't help. Because that way they can put it in the news, in the mainstream media, so that way you can sell it to people and say, see, we are here. They're just lying, or they're delusional, or it's the crazy conspiracy theorists, as usual, of the right wing, the far right. Because we all know how that works, right? Even here in the US, that's a rampant thing. Everywhere, in the Eurocentric world at least, is this way right now politically. Where everything is, you know, that's like that says these things is automatically far-right conspiracy theory. It's a lie. It's fabricated. It's this. It's Russian disinformation. It's election year. It's always Russian all of a sudden. If it's not Democrat backed up, you get the idea. And so as a result, it should infuriate you. It should make you very angry and very upset. And it's something to keep in mind because currently that is what's happening in Asheville. It's happening all throughout Western North Carolina, Northern South Carolina, obviously, Eastern Tennessee, and the devastation they've happened. This is exactly what they're experiencing. It's exactly what the Byron Bay area of Australia experienced back in 2021 and 2022 with the devastating floods that, in their case, was manufactured. Obviously, this hurricane was not manufactured. Well, at least it probably wasn't. But you get the idea. So both devastating floods, all this other stuff, record-breaking, the regions never experienced stuff, at least not on record like this. There's infinite parallels. They're like identical to each other, including, again, this lack of government response and care. So there is a chance within the next couple of weeks that we could suddenly see National Guard or some other military personnel or FEMA or something show up, maybe for, at most, maybe for like a couple of hours, actually sort of help clean some stuff up and seem useful. But I guarantee you're going to see cameras, like full DSLRs. You're going to see video cameras, whether they're phones or camcorders or whatever else. Maybe even some media teams show up to film them, or media level, mainstream media level cameras. These huge, massive, heavy shoulder mount cameras, or big tripod mount, hydraulic mount cameras. I guarantee you're going to find those with ease. Probably drones that are going to get footage as well. And then they'll probably disappear at most after a couple, 3 hours. Maybe they might stick there for the day to act like they're useful, get a full day's worth of media, opportunities in terms of, again, the photographs and the films and everything else they're getting. And then they'll leave and they won't come back. So keep your eye out for that, or again, the Maui possibility. But it's something to keep in mind and let sink in, because this, again, is already way too paralleled. So I have, of course, naturally, and I'm sure you have too, seen a handful of people, some out there, suggest that the reason why the government hasn't been able to send any aid is because, don't you know, that no one has been able to get there or through or in or out at all. There's just too much flooding and devastation, and thus it's far too dangerous of conditions for anyone to be able to get there to help. So, no duh, the National Guard and FEMA can't get there. Naturally, I'm sure we've all heard at least somebody suggest and say such a thing, especially with extreme confidence, like, duh, obviously that's why. However, just for a moment, give that some, see that with some credibility, because I can personally sort of understand where they're coming from. It does make some sense on the surface, especially if you look at it from an average bystander kind of point of view, right? Everyday people, yeah, of course, that makes total sense. But there's some things to consider. no matter which way you're looking at it, whether you're looking at it against it or looking at it with it in agreement at the moment and saying this is credible. Because here's the thing. A, the government is supposed to be doing this. This is supposedly the point of the government, especially specifically the National Guard and, of course, FEMA. FEMA, of course, stands for the Federal Emergency Management Administration. That's literally in their name. It's their fucking point. This is why they exist. They're trained specifically for this. They're supposed to set up preemptively for these kinds of disasters, by the way. So is the National Guard, actually. They're trained for this stuff. They're literally the supposed leading coordinators in emergency management. And that includes, of course, natural disasters. They are specifically trained in this. They're very experienced in it. Both of them are. National Guard, though, hands-on, is specifically that way. And that's really important to note because they are military. The National Guard has specific training specialized in exactly natural disasters, okay? And not just management, but actually responses specifically and preparedness. They're literally the main reason, as I aforementioned, that they exist in the everyday context is to immediately respond both preemptively and during and after to natural disasters, especially big, large-scale, major ones like a hurricane. Their entire point is to respond to these things and be there, to be able to direct people, to be able to help people, to rescue people, to save people, to identify people, to find people, to evaluate damage, to save lives, right? To be able to get people to safe places, safer places at least, be able to get people to dry ground, be able to get aid in and move it around, be able to move people. If people need to be moved because they're on their roof or they're up a tree or whatever else to try to avoid drowning or whatever, they're there to do that. They have all the, not just training and experience, they have the specialized equipment, supplies, skills, awareness, and of course, vehicles. Specifically, the boats, the amphibious military vehicles, and of course, the fucking helicopters. They have full military helicopters, for Christ's sake. They are meant, not just for personnel carrying, even the ones that aren't literally personnel carriers, like a Chinook, they are literally there, like a Black Hawk even, is there to be able to hold up to, I think, like 6 to 10 people in it relatively comfortably to get them from point A to point B faster than an actual transport helicopter is, but with artillery, with actual weaponry. Or in this case, it's exactly what the Coast Guard and even search and rescue uses. Sometimes scaled down, sometimes full size. They use this same kind of Sikorskis and other things like this to be able to have a good amount of people, be able to fit full stretchers, sometimes multiples into them, have these big long rope and pulley systems to be able to attach those to and drop them down into floodwaters or whatever else, along with 1 or 2 personnel to be able to help hook people up to these pulley systems and or strap them into the stretchers and other medical devices that they have like that, and be able to then bring them back up into the helicopter to do medevac and things like this. That's literally the point of these helicopters. The important overall oversimplification immediately to know is that, again, the National Guard has specialized equipment that literally nobody else has access to. They have that, and they have the specialist training in those things as well with them. Another thing to consider with this perspective that people have of like, oh, well, this is why, is because they can't access it, that it kind of starts to fall apart on itself, is the additional reality that for roughly the last, I'd say, 3 to 5 days, it seems like in many places in western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, the worst places affected by Helene and her flooding, have actually been moving around, mobile. There's been people that have been able to get around quite a bit. One example is the fact that there have been people, again, as I aforementioned in the beginning, who have been fortunate enough in their lives to be able to have enough success, financially and otherwise, to be able to have access to power supplies, to things like solar banks and solar panels. Therefore, they are able to power things up, including things like Starlink, to get internet out there so that people have the ability to let their loved ones know they're okay. There's at least 2 people that I know have set up 2 different Starlink locations, and thus power locations, in 2 different locations in Asheville alone. So there's that aspect. And then there's the everyday people who are the victims of this horrible natural disaster, this devastation, who have been able to get to these places, as well as being able to get to various stores and things like this to try to get supplies. Since there's no aid from the government, they don't have aid supplies. So they can't go to like a location specific for aid for food and water, even just simply the basics of life like that. No, they have to go to normal stores. The problem is the police won't allow literally anybody into the stores. They're telling them they're not allowed to allow anyone into the stores, specifically for survival supplies. So, you know, propane for maybe a camp stove so you could boil water or cook, or food itself, even a snack, you know, over-the-counter, I don't know, allergy medications or something, because I imagine the mold's going to go through the fucking roof, let alone autumn pollen and other leaf molds and things like that, which this flood is going to exacerbate the fuck out of that, and other things like this. There's going to be people that need their allergy medications really bad. They're not going to be able to get that. Maybe there's a pharmacy inside. They can't access that either. They're literally not allowing people to access anything. You can't have your medications. You can't have your allergy pills. You can't have your melatonin or whatever might help you sleep. Some St. John's wort, I think, is one of the other things that help people sleep. You know, you can't get your food. You can't get a snack. You can't get water. You can't get anything to drink. You're literally not allowed to get anything. Oh, but there's plants on the outside, but then you're not allowed to go in to ring it up. But the stores are technically open. The doors open. They have power in some of these stores that people are going to. And there's literally employees inside. But they're pointlessly working because the police are apparently told you can't allow anyone in. You're not allowed to buy anything. You're not allowed to go into the store. You're not allowed to touch the premises of the store. I assume they're probably told to go hands-on and treat them like a criminal if they disobey a lawful command. When it comes down to being told what they're told to tell them, which is you're not allowed to do anything. You don't have aid either. Government's not helping. What the fuck are people supposed to do? They can't get food, at least not safely. They have no food. They have no safe drinking water. The drinking facilities, at least that I know of in a lot of these places, still aren't up and running again. Plus, even if they were, they're going to have to clean the entire place out before they can even turn the power back onto them. But then they also need the power stations and grid back up before they can run the fucking water pumps and the cleaning stations and everything, and the water, you know, sanitization places. For some reason, I'm having a hard time remembering the name of them for some reason, but you get the idea. So that's a whole clusterfuck. And then on top of that, yeah, they have to, once they get the power on, they can't just turn it back on again. They have to clean everything up and probably out. They probably are going to have to purge their entire systems. Guaranteed, the actual spinning, you know, separation of these water plants and same with the sewage plants are going to have to purge a lot of extra stuff and literal shit too, because it flooded. Now it's going to have debris. It's going to have leaves. It's going to have sticks. It's going to have twigs. It's going to have rocks. It's going to have gravel. It's going to have sand. It's going to have mud. It's going to have dirt. It's going to have everything in your dead grandmother inside of it. And it probably actually dead animals and fish. You're not going to be able, and they can't function correctly with that stuff in there. So you can imagine the logistical nightmare that these places are going to have too. And so you're going to have, because of all the flooding and the damage and everything, there is a strong chance that they have to go through this whole multi-day or week or month-long process of purging this entire systems, sanitizing over and over and over again internally in the pipes and everything else before they can actually viably start pumping again and start giving people water again. Which is something you have to consider. There's so much excess nuance that I don't think anybody really thinks of, because nobody likes to think past the tip of their noses, because nobody has an attention span anymore. But the fact, and people get hung up on specific things, but the fact is you have to consider things like that too. That's an excess detail that nobody's probably thinking of, but it's a really important thing to consider. When you have catastrophic flooding like that, these places now have to completely reset, like as if they just got built, or if they have to destroy them and rebuild them, because of how devastating that can be on those systems. But again, that's still multiple steps forward from where we are now, and they are now. because you still have to get the power grid back up. But then that's a problem because that's probably heavily damaged because of water and mud and sticks and rocks and everything else I before mentioned, beyond potentially bodies or whatever else. It's not a good time. So now you have to fix and clean all this other shit, maybe repair or literally replace entire pieces of transformers and substations or whatever else. And then maybe you can finally say, okay, it's safe enough now, we can restore at least some of the grid. I'm sure it would have to go in phases, but it's a nightmare. And it's worse when you don't have any aid. Because again, you're basically telling people you have to starve, you have to go without your medications, you have to go with extreme allergy problems. If you require things like melatonin to sleep, well, you're never going to sleep again. You have fun being extremely manic and thus getting schizo, because that's what your brain naturally does when it desperately needs sleep. It's trying to get you to go to sleep and run away hide into a comfortable place, dark place, so that it can make you conk out and go to sleep because it desperately needs it. So your brain starts going schizophrenic when you don't hallucinate and everything else. When it gets really bad and you get really paranoid, the more manic you get. It's a huge problem. But they're basically telling you are not allowed to sleep. You're not allowed to eat. You're not allowed to hydrate. You're not allowed to drink. You're not allowed to be safe. You're not allowed to live. Go fuck yourself. That's basically what's happening to them. And that's something else to keep in mind. But ultimately, because of the lack of this aid, it rounds us back to the whole point of, because these people are allowed to get around, and they are able to get around, they have for a handful of days, it does mean that if the average everyday person and victim of these things, that some of them probably are actually injured and genuinely don't have sleep, so they're lethargic, are somehow able to do this, then it definitely means that the military and FEMA and Red Cross are more than capable of also getting around themselves. Therefore, the theory that, oh, well, it's because it's so devastating, it's too dangerous, and there's too much damage and everything else and flooding perspective that's still floating to this day, almost a week later, is BS. It falls apart and implodes in on itself because it doesn't work. That's where we are at right now with North Carolina and Tennessee, and thus also South Carolina and potentially Georgia and even parts of Bama and Virginia. This again being, there's no aid. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't give a fuck about any of us. The government never has. They never fucking will. And now they're very brazen about proving it to us in our faces, saying, here, we're going to take this taxpayer money the day before you get absolutely annihilated and probably lose your life, and hand it over to these countries over here so they can continue to kill people and give even more dead people in the world. Here's a few billion of your dollars. It's an insult. Beyond. But what is there even a human term for it? They don't give a fuck about you. They never have, and they never fucking will. It doesn't matter their party or their political affiliation. It doesn't matter if it's the United States you're talking about, Canada, Mexico, freaking Kyrgyzstan, Kiribati, fucking Seychelles, or fucking, I don't know, Cabo Verde, or fucking Russia, or it literally doesn't matter where you are. South Africa, Botswana, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. Your government has never and never will ever give a flying fuck about your existence. To them, you are just but a number. You are a statistic. You are a really annoying, aggravating piece of shit that for just 1 year, or maybe a few months out of a year, every so often, they suddenly value us and you and your opinion and your thoughts as a constituent, as one of their people that they are there to serve. But really, they don't, because it's just a number. A number that in English is called a vote. VOTE. That's all you are to them. And a really annoying number called a vote. And that's it. You are expendable. You are useless beyond your number that you can give them via that word. Vote. That's it. You are nothing to them otherwise. And they prove it more and more often, more and more audaciously and brazenly, with less and less fucks to give about how they appear to us. This is proof of it right here. Maui was proof of it. In Australia, down under, it was proof of it with the floods. They don't give a fuck about you. They never have, they never will. You do not matter to the government or to politicians of any kind ever. You never have, you never will. That is something that this proves. And again, this is overall picture where we're at right now after Hurricane Helene. It is a little akin in some ways to the lack thereof of government response in aid to the victims of Hurricane Katrina back in 2005, I believe it was. It was either 2004 or 5. They did very minimal amounts of aid and intervention. They did as little as they possibly could get away with. And the moment they felt they could get away with leaving permanently, they did. They also waited as long as they possibly felt they could get away with, which I think was like somewhere within like a week or two after the devastation happened of Katrina and it had passed, they finally started to reluctantly come in. That's very familiar because as the victims of Katrina could tell you, or just looking back at the footage, or looking back at everybody ranting about it, everyone collectively knew the government didn't give a fuck about them. They didn't care at all. They didn't want to be there. They didn't want to give them aid. They don't care. They don't care. They really don't give a fuck. And it was proven even back then too. It's also proven again that progressive brazenness, where they're getting more and more progressively brazen about showing us how they literally are void of any compassion, care, or fucks to give about our existence. Something else to let sink in and keep in mind. The full picture really does paint that. As George Carlin would say, they're laughing up in their high offices and in their mansions in Cape Cod or Miami, Florida, ironically, or LA, knowing how well they got us by our balls. They got you by the balls. Know that they know that there's nothing you can do about it. And there's nothing you will do about it. And it's the unfortunate truth and reality of the situation. Still, to this day, more now, I would say, than ever. So that said, hopefully things change and for the better, but I doubt it. Here's something I want to say though about this is that there's one nasty positive benefit. And I say nasty positive because it's a negative positive, if that makes any sense, is that it does force and prove that we are fully capable of setting aside any and all differences and not even stopping thinking about these weird differences, because people are so obsessed with our differences these days and seeing it as a negative thing, something that pisses them off, something that makes them upset or offended or whatever else. That's just the American way these days. And yet, when something like this happens, Hurricane Helene, all of a sudden, nobody thinks about their differences. Nobody gives a fuck. Nobody cares. Even people who are some of the most prejudiced pricks on this earth, in that moment, and for that period of time, will suddenly not see color. They won't fucking have any of their prejudices at all. They won't even bat an eye at it. They help. Community. That's what it is. The benefit is community. Community action. Everybody coming together as one functional family unit and showing compassion and understanding for each other and helping each other. Even when they themselves are a horrid victim. They're reaching out to try to do everything they can, not just to help themselves and their own families, but help each other, even complete strangers. That's the one benefit of government proving they don't give a fuck and refusing to do anything, refusing to care, refusing to send aid, refusing to give a fuck at all to anything about this. That's the one really sick, twisted, upside down, backward benefit of it. Is that it forces everybody to get along, get together, put their heads together, and work together to pick up the pieces, save as many lives as they can, get people moved as they can, clean up, and rebuild on their own. It forces a communal self-sufficiency. That's what it is. And that's the weird, morbidly twisted, roundabout, backward, upside-down benefit of these negatives, of the lack of fucks to give that the government has for us, of the aid organizations even have, is that. Because that's exactly what's transpired and has been forced to transpire, whether people there in Asheville or elsewhere realize it or not. And I think that's a beautiful thing to recognize. And to hopefully it means that they will continue to be more self-sufficient than ever, especially if they never do get that aid, right? If they never do get that government intervention and aid, it may benefit them permanently as a very together, meshed, tight-knit community of self-sufficient people. And that also may become a hotbed of revolution at some point if the government pushes a little too much further and too hard against their values and what benefits us as a people and them as a community, because they're unified now so tightly and so strong, no matter their differences. They've had this experience together, and that's something you can never take away from somebody. Our community, that is eternal. That, like, it gets imbued in your DNA. It's passed on in other generations, and then they hear the stories and it like reinforces that, and it becomes more powerful, more intergenerational, and it just becomes this beautiful communal, self-sufficient, self-defensive community where they don't need anybody else. They don't need the government. They don't need anyone else. They know how to do it, and they know what to do now. And they will teach that to their other kids, their future generations. They will pass that on, and it will become just this perpetual, beautiful thing of love and kindness and compassion and understanding and self-sufficiency. And that's epic. But that's all I have to say on the subject for now. Thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, whether it is about, again, the lack of government fucks to give, the lack of aid, the lack of response, the convenient day before they get nailed, their states suddenly hand their National Guards over to Kuwait. What you think of the Kuwait situation, the Maui situation, Australia, now your experiences literally firsthand in these places, whether it is from Helene, whether it is from Katrina or Andrew or all these other hurricanes or typhoons or, whatever. And let me know your perspective and what you think in the comments below, if you so desire. Outside of that, I'm going to shut the hell up now, and stay safe out there.